Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to talk about the causes of the revolution. In order to understand this, we have to go back to the beginning of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. So since 1688, there was a huge fight to see which country would be the one to gain the most territory in the New World. And the struggle was between the English, the French, and the Spanish. The specific war we need to focus on, though, is one that actually George Washington accidentally started. If we look at this map, you can see the original 13 colonies in this dark orange color here. The light color is New France, and the tan color is the disputed areas that they both wanted to claim. I know, sorry, the colors are quite similar. The French wanted to connect New France to the Mississippi River so it would be easier to trade their goods, and they wanted to capture more land, especially for the fur traders. Fur hats were a big hit back in Europe, and French traders had been traveling through these undisputed territories with Native American guides for years. Actually, if it comes up on the test, the French were generally much kinder to the Native Americans because they traded fur with them and traveled with them through this territory. So that is a good kind of comparison between the English and the Spanish. In order to gain this territory and keep the British in their place, they began to build multiple forts along the edge of the British borders. You can see them on this map here. I'm not going to go into specifics of the war because it is highly unlikely that you would be tested on this. In fact, that's for most wars as well. But you do need to know the impact. After the war, the colonists came out feeling super confident about themselves. They were proud of their efforts in the war, and they felt that they had fought bravely next to the British soldiers. The British, on the other hand, saw the colonists as uncivilized. One of their generals actually said the colonists were dirty, cowardly dogs. The colonists also realized that the British soldiers weren't invincible because they watched them lose several battles during the war, and they gained a lot of military experience. All of this will be really important when the Revolutionary War begins. Another impact was that the war removed the French from North America. The French forts and the people in the West were what was stopping the Americans from expanding further westward, right? So those forts were stopping the Americans from going west, and the French as well, which is something that they desired. And lastly, and probably most importantly, war costs money. The British came out of the 7 Years' War with £140 million in debt, and the British felt the colonists should have to pay for some of these costs since the British soldiers were there to protect the colonists and their homes. This led to all those taxes we're going to talk about in just a minute. Another cause of the Revolutionary War was something we talked about last unit, which is salutary neglect. Again, this is the period in 1600s and the early 1700s when Britain left the colonists alone, which allowed them to develop their own governments. In America, there were no dukes or princes or barons or bishops or any of those titles. Instead, property ownership and political participation were pretty easy to come by. So they had a lot more access to things, and during this time of salutary neglect, they got used to running their own affairs. Then, when Great Britain tried to come take those away, it was like a freedom that was being taken away that they had always had, and it was something they were not willing to give up. Okay, next I want to talk about economic, political, and social factors of the causes. I broke them down into these categories because I think this is how they would ask you about them on the test rather than just like a chronological order. So I'm going to start with the economic causes of the revolution. We talked earlier about mercantilism and the Navigation Acts. This is an example of Great Britain trying to gain control over their colonies early on. Remember, mercantilism is the belief that the colonies were there to serve and provide for the mother country. The Navigation Acts were meant to enforce this, but they weren't super effective, and the colonists still smuggled goods. But at the very least, it made colonists feel like they were being used. But in 1763, one of the first things Great Britain tried to do to lower their debt was enforce these laws, something that had been pretty relaxed so far. The colonists absolutely hated this. Ben Franklin even wrote in 1775 that we have an old mother that peevish is grown. She snubs us like children that scarce walk alone. She forgets we're grown up and have a sense of our own. So as you can see, the colonists are really upset at the British government trying to come in and force things to happen, force laws that they hadn't been enforced previously. Now, for the Proclamation of 1763, after the 7 Years' War, the French were removed from the West and the Spanish from Florida. You can see this on the map. This left the Native Americans with less power because they used to pit the European nations against each other, but now they're left alone with just the British. Sensing this difficult situation, the Ottawa chief, Chief Pontiac, in 1763 led several tribes in a violent rebellion, killing 2,000 soldiers and settlers just west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British retaliated quickly to Pontiac's rebellion, and they were pretty cruel about it. One commander even ordered blankets to be infected with smallpox and then given to the Native Americans. This quick reaction did stop the rebellion, but this rebellion convinced the British that they needed to stabilize the western frontier and the relations with the Native Americans. They decided to keep regular troops stationed there and required the colonists to help pay for this cost. And they passed something called the Proclamation of 1763, which forbid the colonists from settling in the area past the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists were outraged. They felt that this land was their birthright and that they had fought a war for it, and many of them ignored the law anyways and moved. Okay, let's talk now about the Tea Act. There are several acts during this time period. If you know the ones that we're discussing in this video, this should be plenty to answer any short answer question, any essay question that you might have. So in 1773, the British East India Company had 17 million pounds of unsold tea, and they were facing bankruptcy. The British government would lose a lot of tax money if they went out of business, so they decided to help them by giving them a monopoly in the American colonies, meaning they would be the only ones to sell tea there. This actually, surprisingly, made the tea cheaper for Americans, but by this point, this is after the Stamp Act and the Boston Massacre and other protests, they felt it was a trick, and so they refused. This led to colonists up and down the colonies destroying the tea or leading mass demonstrations. And in Boston, about 100 colonists dressed as Native Americans and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The last economic impact I want to talk about is the Quebec Act. After the Boston Tea Party, Parliament decided to respond with acts that would punish Boston. These were called the coercive acts, but they were so horrible that the colonists called them the intolerable acts. They closed the port of Boston, took away their town meetings, and included the Quartering Act, which required them to house soldiers in their own homes. The Quebec Act was passed at the same time as these intolerable acts. And this gave the French people who still lived in this area after France lost the war, the area in the northwest. This upset colonists even further, especially those who are looking to expand. And so this is another economic factor because, as we know, owning property is a big economic thing. Okay, let's talk about the political factors. War probably could have been avoided if the British government had not tried to take away the colonists' political rights. In fact, colonists actually paid less taxes than people who were living in England. So it's not necessarily about the money particularly. It was more about their rights that they felt were being violated, in particular their political rights. The Sugar Act that was passed in 1764 was the first law that was meant for raising money for the crown. It taxed foreign sugar coming from the West Indies, and the colonists protested the amount, and then the amount was lessened. So that was good, but the Sugar Act is an example of this political issue. Then in 1765, the Stamp Act was passed to help raise a new military force. A stamp was required for things like a bill of sale, pamphlets, newspaper, marriage license, even playing cards. You had to go buy a stamp. It was essentially you're paying a tax on these products that you're purchasing. Most importantly, this act violated their colonial assemblies because they had not voted on this direct tax. This is where the idea of no taxation without representation comes from. They wanted their colonial assemblies to approve the taxes first. So it's not necessarily that they were against paying taxes, it was more that they wanted to choose which taxes they were going to pay. In response, the colonists formed something called the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. It brought 9 of the colonies together to discuss what they were going to do. Last time we talked about, in a previous video, we talked about the regional differences of the colonies. Well, the Stamp Act Congress was something that helped unify the colonies with one common goal despite all of these differences. They decided they would organize non-importation agreements against the British goods, which were boycotts against things that were made in Britain. So now the American people are united in common action. It became fashionable, actually, at the time to wear homemade clothing instead of buying British textiles. This form of protest was pretty easy for Americans to take part in. Women even got involved by holding spinning bees, where they would make homespun clothing together. The Stamp Act got more Americans involved in political protest and helped unify the colonies even more than before. So this is a really good example of something, if they do ask you about the unifying the colonies, of how this does bring these different colonial regions together. Also, the boycotts were super successful and caused the Parliament to actually repeal the Stamp Act, which did seem to be a victory until Britain passed something called the Declaratory Act, which said that the Parliament had the right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And that's in quotes. So, to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In each colony, they began to also create something called the Committee of Correspondence. This started in Massachusetts with Samuel Adams and John Adams, and soon every colony had one. Their main function was to spread the spirit of resistance by sending letters and keeping the opposition to the British policy alive. So they would announce and organize boycotts, send information about British wrongdoings, and so on. Then in 1774, in response to the intolerable acts that were put in place to punish Boston, remember this was after the Boston Tea Party, the First Continental Congress was formed. It included 12 of the 13 colonies. Any guesses about which colony didn't join? It was Georgia. Georgia did not attend, and that's because they have really close ties to England at the time. People like George Washington, Patrick Henry, and John Adams met for 7 weeks to decide what to do about this whole situation. And they decided to create a complete boycott on all British goods and not just ones imported in the colonies. But they also decided now wasn't the time for independence, so they weren't quite to that point yet. They just wanted things to go back to the way they before all this taxation began to start. Parliament rejected their petitions, and Americans began at this point to prepare for conflict. Okay, let's look at the social factors now. The frontier thesis is something Frederick Jackson Turner wrote about in his paper titled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. We talked about this in our unit when we discussed imperialism. But he talks about how the frontier, or the unsettled land, was more than just a place for Americans. It represented opportunity. The theory was that unlike in Europe, when hard times came, the unemployed could move to the wilderness, take up farming, and that they would prosper. This opportunity released Americans from thinking like Europeans and allowed them to form democracies. They didn't need standing armies or kings or nobles. They could just go take the land if they wanted, which gave them more rights and more freedoms. The Boston Massacre is the next thing I want you to think about. It's something that we covered in class a lot. Remember the picture engraved by Paul Revere with that little dog just chilling in the middle of the massacre, right? Well, about 60 townspeople gathered in Boston to protest, and the British soldiers fired on the crowd, killing 5, including an African American named Crispus Attucks. This led to the emotionalism of the war, and this is why I put it in the social part. It made the colonists feel for the situation, and the propaganda behind the engraving and messages sent encouraged more people to support the cause. The next one I want you to add to your list is the Boston Tea Party. We talked about this in the video already, so I'm not going to go into it, but it is another emotional factor, right? This idea that people are dressing up and protesting in this manner is a very social thing. It's an emotional part of the war. And then lastly, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. In April of 1775, after the meeting of the First Continental Congress, colonists were preparing muskets. They were openly drilling in preparation for the conflict. The British commander in Boston, so the guy in charge there, sent troops to Lexington and Concord to seize the colonists' supply of gunpowder and also capture rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. They first met at Lexington, and this is a massacre. And then they're marching to Concord, and the colonists hid behind the walls and fired on the redcoats, who ended up losing 70 men. So with this battle, the war officially started. So the Revolutionary War is a pretty important topic, and they ask actually a lot of questions about it on the AP test in written form. So I want you to be ready for it. In another video, I'm going to go over the impact of the war, but this one's just on the causes. They could ask you things like, describe the factors that increased tensions between Great Britain and its North American colonies. So you could talk about the 7 Years' War, any of the acts, right? The emotional factors like the Boston Tea Party, Boston Massacre. They could ask you to evaluate the extent to which the 7 Years' War marked a turning point, right? So you would have to talk about that shift from salutary neglect to Great Britain having more control over the colonies. They could ask you about self-government's influence on colonial reaction to imperial authority, and that's one of the questions that I put in the previous videos. I'm going to leave you today with this practice prompt. This one is, evaluate the extent of change in ideas about American independence from 1763 to 1783. So this is pretty open-ended. It does give you a lot of things to think about. So take a second, think about what your thesis would be for that. What would your context be? What evidence would you use? And then make sure you check out the video description to get some potential responses. Happy studying, and may the force be with you.